Hello and welcome to our debate, which is the end of the whitewash. We celebrate diversity, and in the arts, many support colourblind casting. From the film David Copperfield to the musical Hamilton, stories are cast to reflect the diversity of our culture. But far from being progressive, critics argue that the racist Victorian society of Dickens' novels and the colonial history of America are thereby papered over and obscured. Should we applaud the overcoming of historical accuracy in favour of racially blind representation and equal opportunities for actors irrespective of race? Or is colourblindness a liberal mistake, a dangerous denial of racial identity and the long history of white supremacy? And we have a very illustrious panel to discuss this subject. Adjoa Andoh is a renowned film, television, radio and stage actor, as well as a director and writer. She's recently played Casca in the Bridges' Julius Caesar, and she's also directed and starred as the eponymous king in Richard II, a critically acclaimed production, as was Julius Caesar. We also have Kehinde Andrews, who's a professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, and has developed Europe's very first Black Studies undergraduate degree. His latest book is Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. And we also have Will Self, who is an award-winning writer, political commentator, and broadcaster. In 2012, his novel Umbrella was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize for Fiction, and in the same year he was appointed Professor of Contemporary Thought at Brunel University. And his latest book, Will, is an experimental work of memoir. So to begin with our opening question, which I'll pose to Adjoa Andoh first, and the question is race relevant to historical stories and portrayals? Adjoa, 3 minutes, thank you.
My dyspraxic child's paediatric occupational therapist described the effort exacted every day on the dyspraxic person like this. So the average person walks along a street to the postbox, posts a letter, walks away. The person with my child's level of dyspraxia walks up a steep hill, watching the ground so they don't turn an ankle en route, judges the angle of the postbox mouth to the angle of the letter insertion, posts the letter, then walks cautiously back down that steep hill. And repeat that same level of extra effort every day. In this country, as in any majority ethnically European country, especially one that has colonial adventurism in its DNA, in such a country, if you are a child of colour, the effort of your daily life is like that of the dyspraxic child. The difficulty for that child of colour here encountered is not one of inherited physical disability, but the disability of projected social prejudice and assumption. So the weight of that projected social prejudice mitigates daily against our confidence and presses on us a relentless internal conversation, questioning our gifts, our intuition, our responses. It's debilitating, and it demands huge reserves of concentration, self-reflection, and discernment to hold one's ground. I don't want to be here having this conversation. I have bok choy and broccoli outside that needs planting. But for all the young me's, the young Kehindes, the young Wills, the young Sineads, the young Joannas, I want to share through my work the richness of who we are, that we are all of equal value and worthy of equal interest simply because we exist, and that's enough. So to the point. The original question, should we applaud the overcoming of historical accuracy in favour of racially blind representation and ignore race as a relevant characteristic in all circumstances? Or is colourblindness a liberal mistake, a dangerous denial of racial identity in a long history of white supremacy? So I have to say, the positing of this question tonight speaks to either the event organisers' ignorance or more likely to their desire to provoke. But indeed, it speaks also to our national ignorance as a country of our history and the place of a range of heritages and contributions within it. But Kehinde can speak with more authority on that. I've had 30 years of my children in education. One of them is a teacher. My mother was also a history teacher. And I don't know about you, but over those 30 years, it seemed to me that my kids mainly learnt about the Tudors and the Nazis. And then not even about the huge trading and multicultural life of the Tudors, nor the military service and sacrifice of the colonial armed forces in all the wars, or the murder in concentration camps across Europe under the Nazis of Europe's existing populations of colour. Without a proper assessment of our history, no wonder we are confused about who we are in this ahistorical fantasy land. There is always a conversation to be had about the man-made barriers of class and race and gender and ability, disability and sexuality and income and caste. But that conversation is always also about the integration and contribution of that shared humanity, the reality of the lives lived. Take Nelson's column, The Frieze at its base. Nelson is being held by a black sailor because a fifth of the British Navy at that time approximately was black. So to that question, let's overcome historical inaccuracy in favour of racially accurate representation and gender and class and sexuality, etc. So that's a lot of dramas we'd have to ditch, even really contemporary stuff. Have another go with lots of historical dramas. War movies. The first British troops sent into Ypres in 1916 to road test the effects of mustard gas on the human lung, for example, were the British Indian regiments who died in their tens of thousands for king and country. Queen Charlotte, wife to George III, not Helen Mirren, I'm afraid, mixed race. Daughter of Alfonso III of Portugal and his African mistress, who of course has no name. It's in contemporary documents of the time, so Meghan Markle late to that party, I'm afraid. I've just filmed a Netflix series with a mixed-race Queen Charlotte in which I play a Dowager Duchess, Bridgerton, coming soon. So what we're talking about here is reintegrating our history.
I want to turn now to Kehinde Andrews for the same question, which is race relevant to historical stories and portrayals? Kehinde.
Yes, so race is always relevant, and the colour blindness is always a bad idea. And I give you lots of examples of where it's a bad idea, but generally to ignore race and to ignore colour is to just give space to whiteness. That's what we're really talking about. Because this is the idea that when we talk about race, you're talking about people of colour. But white people have race. And in fact, white people's race has probably been the most important because it has shaped our history, culture, etc., etc. So when you say colour blindness, we're really saying let's ignore the critique of whiteness. And in the TVs and in the art production, you can see this really, really, really clearly. And it's more than just changing the colour of people who are in the cast. It's actually about the stories that we tell. So the stories that we tell in art are the stories that we are comfortable with as a society. They are, like Adjoa was saying, it's the war movies. I mean, I genuinely think that's all we watched in school was war movies and movies about the royal family, right? It's these period pieces where we go back and we romanticize and think about history in this way. One of the only things we really talk about critically in culture and feel comfortable in Britain is class. So there's all these different issues about class, and isn't it great we've overcome class inequality, etc., etc. So there's this comfort in these stories to support the narrative of the society that we're in. There's a more dangerous version of this as well, which is where actually we imagine that those stories are the real story. So, for example, all these war movies, how many black and brown people do you see in them? As Adjoa was saying, the war was the world war. These were empires fighting each other, and millions upon millions upon millions of Caribbeans, Africans, Asians fought in all of these wars, and yet aren't represented in those stories. The same when we think about period pieces. So if you go back to the Brontes, the various Bronte shows that are always shown on TV, and what you always see, it's always homogeneous whiteness, the aristocracy. This is a time when there was slavery. This is a time when there was colonialism. We never hear any of those stories. They're given this delusional fantasy version of reality. And what that does is it really does distort how we understand the present world. We don't generally understand what it means to be British. I don't have to prove that there are black people in Britain 100 years, 200 years ago to prove that I'm British. My grandparents in the Caribbean were born in Britain. It was a colony of Britain. We're only in the Caribbean because we were taken and changed from Africa by Britain. So we've always been here, we've always contributed, but we have a cultural space which completely and utterly ignores them. So the question here isn't, well, it's better to replace blackface characters with black actors. That hardly makes blackface performances okay. And this, unfortunately, is a good analogy because this is largely our cultural production. It is these narrow, relatively racist, highly delusional stories that don't get to grips with the real history of Britain. And just replacing those brown people could never possibly deal with the problem. So it's actually about changing the stories that we tell.
Thanks very much, Kehinde. And now I'll move to Will Self with the same question. Is race relevant to historical stories and portrayals? Thank you, Will.
Well, I mean, it certainly is today, and it's a very contentious issue, and anybody who didn't see that it was contentious would be in some weird kind of denial.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.